Welcome, colleagues, to this second part where we're going to be addressing quizzes, and we're going to be looking at leveraging pools, sections, and categories. I'm going to briefly switch on my video, although I'm pretty sure that all of you have seen me in the previous videos. So this is Cath speaking, and I'm working with SILT as a consultant. And I do have my colleague here with me in the room, Cheng-Wen. I don't know if you've got enough battery power just to switch on your camera to say hi to the colleagues that are here today. Thanks, Cheng-Wen. Thank you. So we a few minutes over time, so I'm going to stop my video at this point and then just proceed fairly briskly with the slides that we have, and we are recording this, so I'm aware that there's a couple of people who may drop off due to load shedding, so we will distribute the link to the recording and the slides after this event. Right, so just a disclaimer, and I know that the people who are in this webinar today have heard this disclaimer before, but I'm just repeating it in case people watch the recording out of context of the other recordings that we have, that these slides are constantly being updated because the platform in itself is in a bit of a state of flux, and as things change, we do update the slides accordingly. And in this particular webinar today, we are going to be taking a look at quiz categories, the question library, question pools, and how to set up and view reports, and also take a look at the attempts log. So the attempts log is obviously when students have attempted to take the quiz, it logs all of those events. So that is what we'll be covering in today's webinar. And similarly to what we spoke about yesterday, because today's webinar is obviously part 2 of the quiz webinar that we actually started yesterday. I'm sure you're very familiar as to what the quiz tool can do, so I'm not going to go through all of these points, but essentially it is a method to evaluate students' learning, and you compose it by adding various different question types, and there are various different properties and restrictions that you can apply to that to actually compose your quiz. And I know that everybody that's in this room here with us has confirmed previously that they have access to Brightspace. So this is a very familiar landing page that you will see when you enter the Brightspace environment. And once you are inside Brightspace on the UCT homepage, you will find your courses. So remember that yours will look slightly different to this because you will have the courses that are aligned to your profile, and you can either access them here from these cards, or you can use this waffle icon at the top here, or it's also called the course selector. Sounds a bit more professional than the waffle icon. So once you jump into a course, most people would probably use these cards on the home page. You will arrive in the home page of your particular course. And seeing as we are focusing on quizzes today, the fastest and easiest way to actually get to the quiz tool would be to go to the activities item on the navigation menu. So under activities, you'll see the drop-down menu will give you quizzes option. But as we've mentioned before in Brightspace, there's often many different ways to actually apply or get to the same point. So another way you could also access quizzes would be to go to the Manage Course option on the navigation bar, and the drop down there, Course Admin, which is the first one, will actually give you access to a page that has all of the tools that are aligned to your particular course. So that's a slightly longer way around to get to it, but the quickest way is to go from activities, quizzes. Right, so the first thing we're going to take a look at are the quiz categories. Now, this might sound slightly familiar if you were in the webinar to do with assignments, and we talked about categories there. It's a very similar way that categories are used for quizzes. So essentially, categories are ways of organizing your quizzes, because sometimes you might end up having a lot of quizzes and it's difficult to find a particular one quickly that you want to maybe get some questions from or review. So having categories is a way that you can actually sort and filter your quizzes. So the easiest way to get to it, very kind of easily, is from this button on the quiz page that says edit category. Now, as we mentioned before, the word edit kind of implies that you may have already set up categories, but in fact, that is the way that you access the area to actually even create a first category. So click on edit categories. And once you are on the edit categories page, you will see the add category button, which makes a lot more sense. So this is where you will be able to fill in the name for your category. It's just a basic text field that will appear. And as you can see, it'll say by default new category. So you take that text away and add in your particular category name. You'll see on the right here is a column called sort order. So that's just very rudimentary. You kind of just apply the numbers to sort the order that you would like your categories to appear in. And this tick in the last column here, this check mark, if it's in use, that means that this particular category name has some kind of quiz elements in it. It has questions in it. So if you decide afterwards that you might want to change these kind of category names and refine them slightly, there's always an option to come back and edit these. So as we said, the name is editable. You can always use the select options on the side here, these check boxes. Remember that the one that is in line with the actual category selects that particular one. The checkbox right at the top is like the select all function. So if you select that, you'll be selecting all of the categories. And we've mentioned the sort order already, and you can see there's a little arrow here as well to sort ascending or descending. And we've mentioned that the in use means that it already has questions in there. So one of the most important parts of quizzes is learning about the question library. So when you are on the initial page that you land on for quizzes, we usually land on this tab here. You can see it's highlighted, which is called Manage Quiz. And that's where you would be adding new quizzes or getting to your categories. So the question library is found on the second tab to the right here. And basically, the library is a central repository area that stores and archives all of the questions. So the value of having the library means that if your question is in the library, it can be reused and reshared across many different quizzes that you would like to compose. So it becomes available in a central space, and that one question, you can compose it once, but it can be reused across many different instances of different quizzes. So within the library, and this is another way to actually kind of sort, filter, and get your questions together, would be to use sections. So the way to think of sections is essentially just to think of folders. That's the easiest way to think about it. And the way to add new sections is once you are in the question library, you would click on the new button, and the first option that pops up is actually section. Below that, you can also see the whole list of the different question types that we actually spoke about yesterday. And if you remember, I also said that each of the question types has this kind of acronym which identifies it. So here on this list, you can actually see those different acronyms that they use for the different question types. So from the question library to create a new section, it will appear as the first item on this drop-down list after you've clicked the new button. Just to point out here that on this question library page, you have a settings option. So the settings option allows you to choose if you would like to see the section sidebar. The section sidebar is this sidebar over here. It just says question library at the moment because we haven't added anything to it, but this is the sidebar. And then view actions in pop-up. So certain functions or options that you may choose, it will pop it up in a new window for you to apply those particular functions. So you can decide whether you would like these options on or off by using these settings. So we are going to be creating a new section or a new folder. So it's quite intuitive. You would be taken to this page where you would fill in what your title is for your new section. And again, as with most things within Brightspace, you can always come back and edit this or change it. So you can give it a title, but you can always update it or edit it later on if you need to. And then you can decide whether or not you would like to hide the section title from learners. So you will notice that sometimes they use the word students, sometimes they use the word learners. It's a little bit interchangeable, but learners are the students. And then you can also optionally have text associated with this particular title. So you see that the title is mandatory, but the text, which is like descriptive, is not mandatory, but you can just add that in here if you want to remind yourself what this section is all about. And similarly, you can also decide to hide this text from the learners. And just interestingly to note that at this point, this is where one of the points where you can actually indicate whether you would like to shuffle the questions in this particular section. So remember, a section is like a folder, and they're essentially saying that any questions that you're going to be adding to this folder, if this is checked, then these questions will be presented in a shuffled order. And Cheng-Wen?
Chris asked whether the library can be shared across different sites, for example, one year to the next.
There's always, with the different components that are within Brightspace, there is a copy, import, export option. So what you can do, it won't be the same source, it will be a duplicated version of that library. So it is possible to target the question library and copy it and import it into another site. So the value of that is that it will give you that jump start, that you wouldn't have to replicate all those questions. But what it does mean is, in that is essentially, if you want to think of it as a branch, so it will be as at that time, and your other instance will live in your other course. So you can move, copy it across, move it across, but then it becomes a separate instance of that same library. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for picking that up, Cheng-Wen. Right, so when you are saving your section, as before, remember that you have the straight save option, and you also have save and new or save and copy. And we spoke about that a little bit yesterday, so that save and new will give you the option to move on and have another section that you would create. All these fields would be blank, and you would fill in for a new section. Or you could have save and copy, whereas say you want to keep the description very similar and you just wanted to tweak something maybe week 3 instead of week 2. You could do save and copy, then everything that you'd filled in would be copied to a new instance, and you would make your slight adjustments before saving. Right, so here we're back on the question library page, but now, as you saw, we created sections called week 1 and week 2, and now you can see that our section sidebar is starting to look a little bit more healthy. We have a couple of sections visible here. So as you can see, it kind of looks very much like your folder hierarchy, your kind of tree directory. So that's why I say if you think of sections as folders, it really does make sense. So here's week 1 and week 2 over here. And you can see them over here as well, week 1 and week 2, and they're represented as little folders. And it tells you here that you now have a total of 2 sections. And remember that we selected for the shuffling to be on. So that's also represented here at this high level on the question library page. And you'll see we have a couple of other columns here that I'm going to come back to in a minute, where it says type, points, difficulty, and mandatory. You'll see those in a minute. We'll touch on those. And it shows you the last modified date. You'll see that there is an action drop-down menu at the section level where you can go back and actually edit the content of these sections. So at the top here, you will see various options as well. So one of the ones I want to draw your attention to is this one called order. So this is, again, another way where you can actually shuffle the order of these sections, how they appear. It's quite rudimentary as well. So you click on order and you would have the listing of your folders or sections as they're called over here, and you would just use the up down arrows to move the selected item up or down in the list and then click save. So you can reorder your sections. And then the other items that are at the top here, this is similar to what we've spoken about before. And these are the multi-action functions. So remember that multi-action functions mean that these elements can only be applied once you select a checkbox here, so that the function can be applied to the selected element. So you can either select a single section to apply it to, or you can check the top checkbox here and select all of the sections to apply it to. So that works for the move option, the delete option, and also the edit values option. So if we take a look at the move option, basically means that you are going to move some questions. So here we're looking at questions. You'll note here that I've actually jumped into the week 1 section. You can also check here at the top in the breadcrumb trail that I'm now in the week 1 folder or section, and we have 2 questions in here, and we are going to be moving a question to somewhere else. So you select the question to move, choose the move option, and you will get this pop-up which asks you where you would like to move it to. So you have the option of moving it to another section, or you can actually push it straight to the root, which is essentially then sitting in the library, but not within any of these folders or sections. The delete option, similarly, you need to indicate which item you need to delete. So similarly, you can do single items or you can do select all, and it will give you the confirmation pop-up to say, are you really sure that you want to delete this selected item? So don't worry, you won't delete something and not notice that you've actually deleted it. And the last one, which is edit values, this is where these items come into play here that we talked about before. Type, points, difficulty, mandatory. So edit values means that you can edit these elements which would be reflected over here. So this is where for the selected question, you could edit the point value, the difficulty. Remember, we spoke about difficulty before. Some people like to kind of assign a difficulty level to a question. Maybe they're creating a quiz where they want to have 5 easy, 5 medium, and 5 difficult questions. If you have used this to indicate the difficulty, that would highlight it for you. And this is where you can actually indicate if this particular question is going to be mandatory. And then those elements would then be reflected here in these columns. So a mandatory question, obviously, as the name implies, if you were going to be using it, say, for example, in a question pool that we're going to look at in a little while, it would mean that that question would always appear. It would be a mandatory question. Right, so here we are in the week 1 section. You can see that from here, this week 1 folder or section is highlighted. You can also check it again in the breadcrumb trail at the top. And here are 2 questions, and it does reiterate that here there's a total of 2 questions. And from the action drop-down menu here, you can see we have various options. We have edit, preview, and attempts. So the one we're going to look at now is this preview option. What happens when you preview a question? It will give you something like this, where it will show you that this is what the question would appear as. This is just a very basic true and false question. When grading, the question would appear like this. So it indicates which is the correct answer. This particular question, there were no comments added and no hints added, but if you had added them, they would be displayed here. And it tells you where this question is being used. So I use this question in another quiz as well. So it's listed it here so that you know if you change this particular question in any way, that change is filtered through to all the instances where this question has been used. Right, back on the question library page, I'm just going to pause here for a moment to check if there's any other questions. You can either type them into the text chat or you're welcome to unmute and just ask, because there's quite a small group of us here today. So just checking in with everybody. Are there any questions up until this point? Chris, I see you've unmuted your mic.
Thanks, Cath. So I see you can import a question from another quiz, which is quite helpful. Is there a way to kind of import and copy so that you can go, I want that question, but I'm going to change it slightly. I don't want to mess up the original one, for example. No simple way to do that.
Yeah, so that is in effect two distinct events or different actions that you're actually taking place there. Yeah, so you would be correct that if you chose the import option, it's essentially looking at the same question. It's one instance, but just pointing to it from different quizzes that you may be referencing it from. So if you didn't want to mess up the original, then you would definitely have to go to the source question and actually copy that one. Because otherwise, if you change that original one, it changes it for all appearances wherever you've referenced it.
Thank you.
Aslam?
Okay, I was just playing around, and that particular question that came in, when you import, it actually creates a copy of the question. And when you change and you save, it asks you which one do you want to change. So you can choose whether you want to change the original one or the copied one or both. It actually asks you that. So while you're talking, I'm playing around. So something that I just noticed. So when you import it, it doesn't import the actual question. It makes a copy of the question. That's what I noticed. But
excellent.
The two are linked somehow, unless you change them separately.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Aslam, for confirming that. So the import does actually kind of make another set of questions. Great. Thank you, Aslam. Right. So just checking back here on the question library page. So here we have, we kind of looking at the same week one section or folder here. And one of the other action menu items is that you can look at the attempts. So this is over here, this little icon indicates that we're actually looking at a individual question here. So if we want to look at the attempts on this particular question, it'll just pop up. Well, obviously you can see here that there was only one attempt on this question, so it's not very comprehensive data, but it just does give you an idea that it gives you a little indication or kind of a summary high-level view of the attempts that have been made on that particular question. So that's just a handy little way to actually see how that question has been answered. So you can also move existing questions. So this is exactly what you're talking about, Aslam and Chris, into the questions library or the sections or folder structure. So you might have composed some questions. Maybe you have some individual questions that you maybe composed a really short quiz and you just put together, say, 3 quick questions, and they weren't categorized. They weren't in sections. They're just kind of 3 questions floating around. You can always go and grab those and then put them into this folder structure and kind of move them into the library. So you would do that by going to browsing existing questions, because they might be ones which are you've composed them, but they're not within the library space. And it will give you this option here where you can actually browse existing questions. So you can actually source where you would like to find these questions. So you can do them by type, and you can also go to the different places where you've actually composed these questions. And then you can select to bring in the questions by just checking the check boxes here and then saying import. So that's quite an easy steps to follow. And then once they're actually imported, you will see them into your designated area where you had imported them. And one thing you might be wondering is, can you have sections within sections? And yes, you most definitely can. depending on how you would like to structure your kind of folder or section hierarchy. I know some people like to keep it fairly simple, but other people really like to have sections within sections within sections. You can actually do that and create sections within other sections. And you can see it's represented here on the sidebar in a very kind of familiar kind of hierarchical structure. So when you are finished editing anything in the question library, you can always exit out of the library by selecting this Done Editing Questions option over here. Right, so let's talk a little bit about question pools. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with question pools within Vula, and you're very familiar with the concept of question pools in that you have, as the name implies, you have a large selection of questions, but you only want to select a smaller amount from that entire question pool. And in this way, each student would get a random selection of questions, and this is something that can actually support and maintain academic integrity, because it means that students will be interacting with a quiz that has a different selection of questions, depending obviously how big the pool is initially and how many questions you've decided to actually pull from that pool. So how do you go about actually creating a pool? So here we are on the page here where we can actually, on our manage quizzes. So remember, this is our default tab that loads when you are on the quiz page. Remember, we were just in this tab over here with the question library. So now we're onto our default manage quiz page. And on the drop down list here, you can go to edit. So we're actually editing an existing quiz here. And within this section here, we touched on this yesterday, you will find a section that pertains to the quiz questions. And this is where you would need to click on the add or edit questions. So you can see that this quiz already has a number of questions in it. And this icon over here basically means that these are shuffled. Okay, so you can see here is another option to indicate for shuffling. Shuffle the questions at the quiz level, and this is the icon for shuffling. So you would click on add or edit questions. And over here, this is where you would find the add button, and the drop-down list there will give you the option to create a question pool. So this is the page that would load when you are creating a question pool. So what you're going to do is you're going to give your question pool an initial title to identify this particular pool. And over here, you'll see that this is where you would indicate the number of questions to select and the number of points per question. So initially, this will say 0 and this will be blank. And that is because you haven't defined the questions that are going to be in this pool yet. So it cannot identify any questions. That's why it's saying 0. So effectively, it's a brand new pool with no questions in it. So now you need to add the questions into the pool. And you do that by browsing the question library. So once you're in the question library, now remember we set up some sections. Here you can see week 1. This is actually expanded at the moment, so you can see the contents within week 1. Here's our other, when we were experimenting with sections within sections. These don't have any questions in them, and this one doesn't have any questions either. So there's only 2 questions sitting in week 1. So if you selected week 1 at this top point here with this checkbox, it would automatically add both of these questions. If you didn't want to add all of the questions within a section, you could go and expand the section and then select the designated questions that you would like to add to the pool. So very easily, you would just check the check mark on the questions you wanted to add to the pool and say import. Now you can see that this is now changed to say from 2, because it now recognizes that you elected to bring in these 2 questions. So now you can fill this in over here and say, how many of these questions would you like to pull from? As this is an exceedingly small pool of 2, pretty much your only option is 1. So you would then put in here, I would like to choose one of the questions from the 2 that I have added here. And you can also indicate the points that you would like to allocate to this. And of course, you can always, if you decide you don't want these questions anymore, you can click on the X to delete them. And you can similarly go and browse the question library again and pull in other questions that you may have in other places to comprise this particular pool that you're drawing up. So once you're happy with this, you can click save. But as with everything, you can always come back to this and edit it afterwards by tossing off questions or adding in new questions.
Cath,
Right, Stefan, yes, you're asking if the questions, what if the questions have different point values? Right, I think this point over here, where it says points per question, if you add it here, it would add those points to these questions, but I feel you can actually still go into these particular questions individually and actually change it. So I think this one over here would take precedence and apply this question point value to the designated questions. But if you wanted to go in and change it, then you could. But the problem with that, with a pool, now that I'm actually saying it out loud, is that you're going to have a random selection. So I think that you are going to have the same point value per question because it's going to be random pulling of questions. Does that make sense, Stefan?
Yeah, it does seem to be the case, because if you do go into that question, then the point is grayed out, and you can't even edit it.
Yeah, I think we answered our own question. Thanks, Stefan. But that's yeah, good to note that, because obviously they've all got to be the same, because you don't know which assortment of questions you would get. Right, so once you created your pool, here it is down the bottom. So you can see these are independent single questions that I have here, but here is the title that I gave my pool. I called it Easy Questions. And you can see here it's identified as being a question pool. And I'm selecting one question from two, and they're worth 1 point each. Right, so here you can see that this is now a pool that has been added to this particular quiz. Right, any other questions around pools before we go on to setting up reports? Right, so setting up reports within quizzes, you have an option here. There is the action menu. So when you click this drop down next to any particular quiz that you have, so remember this is at the quiz level, you can see that because the manage quizzes is highlighted. So this is the initial quiz page that you land on. The drop down arrow will give you this action menu, and you'll see there's an option there that says set up reports, and below that there is view reports. So these two are obviously linked together. They're both to do with reporting, but you cannot view any reports unless you have initially set them up. So if you go to view reports now, not having set anything up, you won't find anything there. You do need to set up reports first before you can view them. So to set up a report, you're just going to click on the add report button. You can see, obviously, we're doing this from scratch because it's reiterating here that there are no reports currently available. So we are going to be adding one and creating one using the add report. So you'll see a lot of options here. And it looks like there are a lot of elements that you can add to your report. And that's a yes and a no. So the first thing to notice is that these report types here. So this is usually presented as one very long list. I've just broken it up here into sections so you can see all of the options in one go. But essentially, there are 5 potential reports that you can have, because you can see here that at the high level of the report itself, like question statistics or question details or user statistics, attempt details, and a user attempts, these are radio buttons. So that you know that you can only select one radio button, so that when you have made a selection of which kind of report you would like to do, the options then come in with these check boxes. What level of detail would you like to include in that particular report? So here you can see these are question statistics. What is it that you would like to show for this particular statistic report if you wanted a statistic report? what level of detail would you like to include if you wanted to go and show particular report on question details, user statistics, attempt details, or user attempts. So you would first select one of these 5 and then tweak what it is that you would like to show within that. You can then also decide when you would like to release this report. You can either just say immediately, or you can release it on a designated date and time. And then you can decide who you would like to make this report visible to. So if you were maybe creating a report that would be really useful for students to see as feedback, you could check that and say this is for students. These are checkboxes, so you can check multiple of these. So you can decide which report you want, what level of detail you would like, when you would like that released, and who you would like to make this report available to. So I created one called question statistics, and I kind of just put everything in there, as much detail as possible, and I chose to release this immediately. You can see there's a very common kind of interface here, so that if you ever want to get rid of this, you would just select this checkbox and use the delete option. But your reports would be defined here, and you can set up multiple different reports. You can just keep on adding different reports. So now that we have a report set up, a very basic one, we can actually go in and view the report now. So back on the kind of home page of the quiz area, the drop-down arrow will give you the option to view a report. So here we have the report that we've just created, the one called question statistics, and you can click on that and you can decide if you would like to set in date parameters here from and to. You don't have to put these in. And then you can decide if you would like to have it in CSV, Excel, or HTML format. So here is, it's a very simple report because there were probably only like 1 or 2 attempts on this particular quiz. So it's very basic, but you can see some of the things that are included on the report. And this is an HTML version that you're actually looking at now. And once you are actually viewing this report, you have the option to export this to CSV, Excel, or to actually print the report at this point. To exit out of this, you would just use this button here, go back to generate report. That would take you back to the previous page that we were on just before this. Right, just checking in with you once more. Are there any questions up until this point before we have a look at the attempt logs on a quiz? Any questions at this point? Right, not seeing anything. So we're going to take a look at the, yes?
There's nothing in the chat.
Okay, great. Thanks, Max. Right, so we're going to have a look at the attempt logs. So obviously, as the name implies, this is the student having attempt to actually take the quiz, what actually happened. So back on the quiz main page here, and these are the quizzes, you would choose the drop-down arrow here and go to attempt logs. So on the attempts log page, you will see at the top here 2 tabs. So it initially opens up on what they call the overview tab, and you can see here there's an additional tab that you can explore here called detailed. At the top here, you have some options, which is kind of events. So you have quiz entry, quiz completion, quiz attempt deleted, or quiz attempt restored. So initially they will appear grayed out, but when you click on them, they will actually appear blue, which is a little bit counterintuitive. So effectively, these text items here are actually toggles. So you are toggling on and off what you would like to see over here. So these are toggles, even though they don't quite look like toggles. So here you can see on the attempt log, in the event column, it tells you what is actually happening here. You can see that there was a quiz started here, quiz entry, quiz completions. So this is kind of, as the name implies, very overview, just kind of when it was started and when it was ended with the date and time stamps. So where more information is stored is actually under the detailed tab. And just to note here that depending on how many results per page you have chosen, you might need to page through to other pages, and you can also change the number of results per page. So on the detailed tab, this is where it actually gets more interesting, and you can actually see exactly what happened. So there's a student here that went through their second attempt. So it was obviously a quiz that had unlimited attempts for it. And you can see here that this gives you a lot more information. Here's page 1 saved, response to question 2. There was 11 characters entered, and then response to question 2, saved 5 characters, response to question 1 saved. So you can see there's a lot more detail, as the tab implies, in the event column over here. And you still have your date and timestamps in the date column over here.